Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. I'm joined by Sheldon Richman, the foundation's vice president. This is the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the libertarian perspective on the burning issues of the day. Sheldon, I thought we'd revisit the terrorist attack in Paris and Charlie Hebdo. One of the aspects that we didn't discuss was one that I think is significantly important, especially with respect to the libertarian principles of a free society, and that's gun control, which, of course, France has long subscribed to, probably for centuries. But before I do that, I thought I'd relate to you this interesting email that I got from one of our supporters yesterday. Yesterday I blogged on the idea that the attack in Paris was really driven by anger and rage arising from U.S. foreign policy, which, of course, the French have been part of since at least 9/11, war in Afghanistan, and so forth. And the lead-in for my article was the lead paragraph from the New York Times that talked about this. One of the terrorists had said that when he saw what U.S. troops were doing to men at Abu Ghraib after the Iraq invasion, that he just got horribly angry, filled with rage, and that this set him off on this journey of taking on U.S. troops and the empire and the coalitions of the willing and so forth. And so this reader writes and says, "Look, I don't accept that this was an attack on free speech, that these cartoonists were doing things that were offensive to Islam, making fun of Muhammad, and that's why these people went after them. And this really has very little, if anything, to do with U.S. foreign policy." Well, my response is that, yeah, on the surface of things, that's true. I mean, the cartoonists were doing offensive things with respect to people who believe in Islam. But I don't think you can divorce it from the reality of what was driving this guy's rage. And that was U.S. foreign policy, specifically what they were doing at Abu Ghraib, disrobing people, torturing them, humiliating them, embarrassing them, taking videos, having women in there, jeering at them. That theoretically, yeah, under ordinary circumstances, all kinds of murders can take place. That, somebody's writing some offensive stuff on Christianity or Judaism or Islam, and somebody goes in there and retaliates. Certainly theoretically possible. But I think that when you have people that are driven by such deep rage, that they sometimes do things that they wouldn't ordinarily do in a society, that they just sort of stay under the radar screen. They know some offensive things are being said or written about their religion, but they're willing to just go along. But once they get filled with this anger and rage, they end up doing things that might be considered irrational and that don't make much sense. And I think that's what's going on here, is that it's the U.S. foreign policy that generated this anger and rage, so that when an event happens like this, people demonstrate that anger and rage by doing these types of killings. What do you think?
Well, look, we know that at least one of these guys was in Syria and Yemen. And had contact with Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, so they weren't. It's not like they were cut off from what's going on in the Middle East, and that they were just French citizens who, got extremely angry at cartoonists. Look, it's certainly much more reasonable to assume that they related it to the greater context, and that was not the only thing on their minds. Otherwise, I don't see how you can fit into the picture these other pieces. The fact that they at least one had been there, maybe two or three of the three, counting the one guy in the kosher market. They had contacts and had been over to the Middle East. And then there's a larger context. There's the whole French experience regarding the Arab world. Of course, France was involved with England in carving up the Middle East. France ruled Lebanon and Syria, Algeria. There was a bloody war of independence in the early 60s against France, where a lot of Algerians were killed. Algerians have lived in France for quite a while, but they're pretty much in sort of ghettos outside of Paris. They're discriminated against. Their life is very bleak. There's not much of a future for young people. Unemployment's very high. they're sort of sneered at by French citizens. They're still regarded as, the Arabs. I mean, put all those pieces together, and you can see how something like a series of cartoons, which some of them are very nasty and even pornographic, which wouldn't justify murder, of course, does not justify murder. But you can see how, put all of that together, the cartoons end up looking like just a symbol of a much larger system that people were incensed about and felt was doing them wrong. So I just do not see this argument that this had nothing to do with anything else but cartoons and an attack on free speech. France, by the way, not exactly a paragon of free speech, as we know, since the day after the march they rounded up 54 people, including a comedian, who admittedly, says some unsavory things about Jews, but nevertheless only speaks, and those people are being prosecuted for that. So I have to disagree with this email writer, because I just don't think it takes account of so much else that we know.
Yeah, and last week you related the interesting dialogue that took place in that kosher grocery store market, where you said that the terrorist there was talking in terms of taxpayers, that people were paying taxes to support this machinery. Would you remind us a little bit about that conversation?
Well, this was Ahmadi Coulibaly, who was the gunman who went into the kosher market and ended up killing 4 people in a terrible crime. And in no way we're seeking to exonerate him, but I don't think trying to understand the situation and the motive counts as exoneration. I mean, prosecutors in trials often present to juries the motive for crime, and no one accuses prosecutors of trying to exonerate a defendant. So in seeking to understand, we should realize that that's not seeking to justify or excuse. So he was recorded by I think a reporter called the store hoping to actually talk to the guy, thinking there'd be a story there. And while he didn't talk to the reporter, but he put the phone down. He didn't hang the phone up. And so there's a recording that CNN was playing all of the weekend of the march a couple weekends ago of Coulibaly talking to some of the patrons of the store, who I guess were sort of saying, "Why are you doing this?" And he said, "Because by paying taxes, you support the government that is doing these things in the Middle East." And they actually engaged in some sort of argument. I mean, one guy said, "Well, we have to pay taxes," and Coulibaly said, "No, you don't. I don't pay," which I thought was sort of interesting. I didn't explain how he got away with that. I'd like to know. And then one guy said, "Well, but we pay taxes, but it goes for highways and schools. We don't harm anybody." And he shot back well, I shouldn't say shot back, because he shot people in that horrible crime. He says to this patron that 30% of your taxes go to the Defense Department, military. So that was what was on his mind. Now, I don't think it's a coincidence that he was in a kosher market. I'm sure he had in mind the association of Israel and its policies toward the Palestinians, which also makes these people mad. We know that it made some of the 9/11 guys extremely angry, and then we've had Gaza, the war in Gaza, in last year, all of which incenses young Arabs and Muslims. So I'm sure he was in the kosher store not by coincidence, but because of that connection, which I don't think is justified, obviously. But nevertheless, he wasn't talking about these people being Jews or infidels, non-Muslims. That's not what he was saying to them. He wasn't engaging in a rant about how you're an infidel. He was talking about how they support France, and he even said, I'm French, and he was a French citizen. He was born in France. His parents were Algerian, but he said, I'm French, and I wouldn't be here, and I take that to mean in the store. I wouldn't be here if they weren't invading other countries, meaning Middle Eastern countries. So that's what was on the guy's mind, not something else. I mean, it was the foreign policy of France. No, it's true. Look, France under President Chirac opposed the George Bush's war in 2003 against Iraq. It hadn't gone to the UN. The U.S. pulled it from the Security Council when it realized it did not have the votes. And Chirac was against that. But Chirac's out of office. And since then, they've had 2 presidents. They've had Sarkozy, and they have the current president, Hollande, and they're all on board with the U.S. policy in the Middle East. They pushed for intervention in Libya. They pushed for intervention in Syria. So it's a different France now from Chirac. So to go back and say they opposed the war in 2003 is rather incomplete, because they've been quite on board. They're involved in Mali. They've been quite on board, since that time.
Yeah, so I mean, it really goes to show you that this rage is driving people that are doing these kind of things is much more than just the publication of some offensive cartoons. I mean, you can see it in that conversation that they're talking about how the U.S., France, and so forth, and other members of these coalitions of the willing, what the things they've been doing in the Middle East. And your point about motivation and justification is absolutely right on. I remember after 9/11 when we were talking about, hey, let's examine foreign policy, and we got inundated with all that hate mail from people that were filled with rage. After 9/11, there was a shortage of rational thinking there too, and we were saying, look at foreign policy, and people were saying, oh, you're a justifier, you're justifying this, and which is so ludicrous. Because understanding, as you point out, what motivates a person to do something is different from coming to the defense of that person. Sometimes if you can understand what's motivating a person, that's important, because if you understand the motivation, then maybe you can alter your own conduct in such a way as to prevent this or discourage others from doing it. And that's exactly what we were saying, is that if you've got a foreign policy in which you're brutalizing people overseas, for example, the sanctions against Iraq that went on for some 11 years, where they were killing hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children as a way to get rid of Saddam. And you've got Madeleine Albright saying, oh, the deaths of these 500,000 children are worth it. She was the official spokesman to the world for the U.S. government, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. I mean, imagine saying the deaths of these children are worth it. And so clearly you have this context where this anger and rage is rising and ultimately manifests itself on an attack on some people that are writing some admittedly very offensive, publishing very offensive cartoons. But let's move over to the gun control issue, which I think is absolutely fascinating here too, because I mean, when our country was established and the government was called into existence with the Constitution, 1789 or so, the American people weren't satisfied with that Constitution. They wanted a Bill of Rights, and they said that essentially the deal was we'll agree to call this federal government into existence, and they didn't trust it. They figured this is going to turn out to be a government that's going to be doing some bad things like all governments in history. So we want an express restriction on power here, and that's what the Bill of Rights were about. It really should have been called, as far as I'm concerned, a Bill of Prohibitions, because it doesn't give anybody any rights. It prohibits the government from interfering or infringing on pre-existing rights. And one of those is freedom of speech, which we've been talking about last week and this week. The idea was that the federal government would end up doing the same things the French government, the Soviet government, the North Korean government, all governments have done. They would punish people for criticizing the government. So our ancestors said, we want to make it real clear, you don't have the power, you people in the federal government, to infringe on freedom of speech. But then that Second Amendment, which I think should have been put first, I think it's much more important, because if you don't have the Second Amendment, then your First Amendment is really of no effect whatsoever. And that's the right to keep and bear arms, which doesn't exist in France. And you and I have addressed this issue for 25 years here at the Future of Freedom Foundation. And there's, to me, two important aspects of this. One is the right of self-defense against criminals, and the other is self-defense in terms of tyrannical governments. Let me start out first with the self-defense argument. I mean, we have long made the argument that if you have gun control, that people who are going to be murdering people, would-be murderers, are not going to care about gun control laws. And it seems to me that's a fairly obvious proposition, because if they're not going to care about murder laws, they're not going to sit there and say, uh-oh, I can't violate the law against guns here. I got to use knives. And they're going to violate both laws. And we see a classic example of this in Paris. They essentially make it illegal to defend themselves, just like they do in Washington, D.C. and New York City and other places that have strict gun control laws. So we don't know whether those people at Charlie Hebdo would have had a concealed carry weapon or whether they would have been carrying it all. But at least they would have had a chance to defend themselves. And that's what gun control deprived them of doing, that none of those people were able to defend themselves. And they had to wait for the cops to show up, which can take, 20, 30 minutes, an hour or so. So here's an example, Sheldon, of where gun control ends up prohibiting peaceful, law-abiding people from defending themselves against people that don't give a hoot about the gun control law.
Right. Things might not have turned out any differently. I think the real lesson for the advocates of gun control is obviously all the laws in France, which are very strict, didn't keep these two brothers from having an arsenal of AK-47s or Kalashnikovs and ammunition, high-powered weapons. They didn't just have some small handguns, which the police, I think, at best had light sidearms, and there was a policeman assigned to the editor, but and there was some bodyguard or kind of guard at the door, but they didn't have a chance. These guys had powerful weapons, and of course they had the element of surprise, but it didn't keep powerful weapons out of their hands. They're all running around now saying how they get these weapons. So the question is, what would the gun controllers do? Put a policeman in just every house to make sure no weapons ever brought in? It gets the old idea of who's going to protect us from our protectors. They don't have an answer to that. Gun controllers just do not have an answer. This is, in their view, this sort of thing's not supposed to happen in France. They should have been able to have handguns, much less powerful rifles. So I don't know what they have to say. In fact, they're strangely silent about it because there's nothing they can say.
Yeah, and even if the person is just carrying a pistol, let's say on a concealed carry basis, inside Charlie Hebdo, one might make the argument, well, he's not going to be able to stand up against this AK-47 or these high-powered weapons, but he can at least buy some time. I mean, they can hold up inside of an office, they can block the door, and they can barricade themselves inside and hold off by firing some shots at the people that buys them the time until the cops who are better armed come in and help them out. But the problem with making it illegal to own the guns, which has to be a felony offense in France, just like it is in New York or Washington, other areas where you have gun control. The peaceful, law-abiding citizen says, okay, I run the risk that somebody's going to attack me, but I also run the risk of ending up with a felony conviction and 10, 20 years in the penitentiary. Most people are not going to take the chance of violating the law, especially since the odds are that they're not going to have to deal with this. Well, the would-be terrorist knows this. I mean, that's why you never see here in the United States any terrorist attacks or mass slaughters at gun shows. I mean, it's just logical. Why would a would-be murderer come in and try to massacre people at a gun show? Everybody's armed. So where they pick is the gun-free zones, the schools, the places where they are fairly confident that people are defenseless. And one of the things that the Paris attack shows, and I think you've made this point over the years, that the government can't be everywhere. I mean, they have flooded the Parisian streets with military troops, but they still can't be everywhere. And here in the United States, if people are going to select soft targets, non-militarized targets, civilians, there's any shopping mall in the country, there's any number of private buildings in the country, all of a sudden they just go in there and start shooting it up. The government can't protect you. Only you can protect yourself, and that's part of the idea of the right to keep and bear arms. That in these states where now you have concealed carry, like here in Virginia, I mean, somebody walks into a mall and starts shooting it up, there very well may be 10, 20, 30% of the citizenry there. They're going to pull out a gun and start firing back. That doesn't exist in the gun-free zones. And obviously, Paris was one great big gun-free zone. And then the other aspect of this, Sheldon, is you end up with this militarized society where you got troops everywhere, troops in front of the malls, troops in front of the private buildings. I mean, what kind of society is that? And so it all goes back again to what we started out this conversation is this is what empire does. And you've addressed this in a fantastic way last Friday in your TGIF article, which I highly recommend everybody reading. It was made the spotlight article at antiwar.com yesterday, where you're either going to have an empire that's going to produce all this blowback and then government assaults on freedom to protect us from the terrorists that are there because of the foreign policy, or you're going to have a free and open society. You can't have both. So why don't you talk about that?
Right. Well, you've covered it very nicely. If the government's foreign policy is making enemies, which I think it's pretty clear that the U.S. government and other governments do, they make enemies for their own populations. And people then want revenge, and they may have thoughts about going to that the country where the government has had the aggressive policy and killing people just to get revenge. Or you can have homegrown, so-called self-radicalized people who observe what's going on and then want to create harm within their own society. When that becomes a threat, then the appeal to the public that we need, the government needs to crack down, it becomes persuasive to most people. They'll think, okay, I guess we need to have limits, some limits. They talk about, where's the balance between freedom and privacy on the one hand and security on the other. And lots of people will say, well, I guess it's unfortunate, but I guess we need that because we have this danger of terrorism, and we don't want that happening, so we'll accept intrusive government activity like the NSA spying, like the threat of indefinite detention, and the Patriot Act, and these other things, monitoring of our financial activities. Lots of people acquiesce in that because they think there's this grave danger. Well, where'd the danger come from? In our view, the danger comes from the foreign policy. So there's your choice. You can have an open society, more or less. It's not as open even before 9/11. It wasn't as open as we'd like. But you can either have an open society or you can have an aggressive empire, because eventually you're going to get to a point where you're going to realize you can't have both things, because the government will crack down on civil liberties in the name of protecting us from the very enemies. Well, it won't acknowledge it's from the enemies it created, but that in fact is what it is, and so that's the choice. I mean, Chalmers Johnson, who wrote a trilogy of books about empire, the American empire, pointed this out, that if you don't dismantle the empire, you are destined to live under it. That might not have been true in the 19th century or points of the 20th century, but now with cheap transportation, right, and almost anybody can jump on a plane, and with the internet, it's possible to become self-radicalized as a lone wolf, to use their expression, and get all kinds of information about how to do damage to people, from making bombs and things like that. That today, I think it is true. You can't have an empire and an open society, and I think we're seeing that. We have seen it.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that for all too many people, the empire is a given, that it's just a permanent part of American life, this whole national security state, giant military, CIA, NSA, and that they just expect the rest of the world to comply with its orders, perform whatever duties the empire assigns them, do it happily and joyfully. Well, that's all fine to have those expectations, but it doesn't work out that way in reality. People don't like empires, including the U.S. empire. And there's always going to be a sector that's going to say, no, get out of our part of the world. We're sick and tired of you. Go home. And when the empire refuses to go home and says, no, we're the world's sole remaining empire, we have a right to be here, you do as we say, inevitably there's going to be a sector of that society that's going to retaliate. And then you've got the whole war on terrorism paradigm where, as you point out, you've got the infringements on liberty. The other aspect, though, that I wanted to get into before the end of the show on gun control is the resistance to tyranny idea. that was clearly the driving force behind the Second Amendment, that our ancestors understood that there's always a possibility that your own government can turn tyrannical. That there's nothing unique about other regimes and other countries where you've got tyrannical regimes. The same thing can happen here in the United States. And at least people have the means, when there's no gun control laws, the means to resist that tyranny. And it also serves as an insurance policy that the would-be tyrants think twice about doing their tyrannical things if they know the citizenry are armed and able to violently resist. Well, that possibility doesn't exist in France or any other European country. That they get a tyrannical regime. The only option is to obey or just die. I mean, and we saw that with Nazi Germany. You got a democratic system that ends up morphing into a tyrannical dictatorship. People don't have the means of resistance. Now, compare that to Switzerland, whose policy on gun rights is very similar to the founding principles of this country. Everybody's armed. Everybody's got an assault rifle in his house. People are well trained. They have shooting competitions where the whole nation is involved in the shooting competitions. Everybody knows how to use a gun. And so they have a very decentralized government. There's virtually no possibility of a tyrannical regime in Switzerland. But also they know that if anybody tries to invade, the whole citizenry can come to defend the country. In fact, that's one of the main reasons why Hitler never invaded Switzerland as compared to invading France. He knew it'd be like swallowing a porcupine versus France, where you got strict gun control laws where only the military had the guns to resist, and they were quickly overwhelmed. So I think that's one of the things that we've got to bear in mind here, that, yeah, self-defense is important against would-be murderers, but ultimately the idea behind gun rights is protect ourselves against the possibility of tyranny.
No, it's true. Even from the politicians' point of view, I don't need to give them any. I don't mean to give them any ideas here, but their grip, it seems to me, would be more firm if they didn't interfere with gun ownership. Now that may sound funny, but the Germans weren't disarmed. The Jews were not allowed to own guns under the Nazis for obvious reasons from the point of view of the Nazis. But they wanted the Germans. It was a militarist society. They wanted them to know about guns, be comfortable with guns. And be able to take up arms. So they didn't. Hitler did not disarm Germans in general. Now you can. It seems to me the best way for politicians to make the people docile is to convince them that all this is really being done in their name, which of course is the theory that the government represents them, right, of and by and for the people. And people are less likely to take up arms against the government that they think actually is representing them. Even if they don't like a particular policy, they may think, well, I get my vote, and therefore, this is I'm part of this, and therefore, why would I take up arms? I mean, this is part of me. I'm part of it. If they want obedient people, they may actually be pursuing it the wrong way, because if you take guns away, which I haven't done lately, but there's always that threat, then you put people on edge and make them think, well, maybe the government's not me after all. They're taking guns. Maybe it is something external and foreign, and I should resist it. So there's a tip to the politician. If you want to maintain your hold, don't take people's guns away. Don't put burdens on them for owning guns.
Well, one of the good things that's come out recently is that public opinion polls reflect that most people now believe in gun rights, most Americans. I mean, that's an incredible achievement, because not so long ago it was the opposite. I think it's a reflection of how libertarians are making progress in showing people the principles of a free society. We're making progress on drug laws. Clearly, there's tremendous movement. It has been, especially compared to the last 25 years that we've been publishing articles on drug legalization here at FFF. Now there's this positive movement on gun rights. We see the positive movement with respect to lifting the embargo against Cuba. Now we need that same positive movement on the empire, the whole military-industrial complex, the whole Cold War era national security state, the giant military establishment, the NSA, the CIA. These are the types of things that are contrary to the founding principle of this country, contrary to the principles of a free society. And if we can start making movement there, Sheldon, then I think we're going to really start making some progress on restoring a peaceful, prosperous, harmonious, and free society. That's the show. That's the Libertarian Angle. I'm Jacob Hornberger, joined by Sheldon Richman. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.